Yeah, so and I'm going to start again. Oh, wait, you started recording. I'm going to briefly talk about human trafficking and human smuggling, and then their relationships, but also differences between these terms in legal systems, but also in broader kind of general terminology. So human trafficking has three main elements in international legal systems and the discourses around it. And one of them is the action, which is basically about the recruitment, the transportation, and the transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons, basically taking somebody or kidnapping, abducting, all of that kind of things. And it also involves the means. What are the means through which these people are being recruited and transported and transferred from one place to another place, and from one chain of a trafficking to another chain of a trafficking? The means often involves the coercion. This is a kind of a forced action imposed on the individuals who are victimized, and it involves fraud, telling people lies, for example, and deceptive kind of processes that tell you that there is an employment opportunity here or some kind of opportunity, and then taking and abusing that. And there is also an abuse of power, and this often happens in situations of domestic abuse, for example, when there is some kind of abuse because of the differences in power relationships and because of other forces as well. And then bribery. And bribery is very common in parts of Africa, particularly around border areas and at border areas and airports, is where people are being trafficked through bribery, and these state or non-state actors are involved in that process. And the purpose is basically for exploitation, and exploitation of different kind of nature: sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, slavery-like practices, where some people, the victims, are owned by another person, the trafficker, as we call them, and they're used by these traffickers for various purposes, for profit, for sexual gratification, and in some cases organ removal as well, or what is commonly called the organ harvesting. And in general terms, human trafficking is seen as a kind of a crime against individuals, the victims, and groups. Sometimes could be a family taken or a group of people trafficked. It can also involve communities as well. It impacts at a broader level some communities as well. And when it comes to human smuggling, we have the term human with smuggling, because smuggling can also mean smuggling of goods, smuggling of drugs, smuggling of so many other things. But here we're specifically focusing on human smuggling. And this specifically refers to the illegal transportation of individuals, often across international borders. And these are the key words: the illegal transportation and the international borders. So if there is a kind of an activity that looks like smuggling within the borders of a given nation state, then that is not seen as smuggling in Palermo Protocol or other kind of protocols, for example. So this is very kind of a specific definition related to the border and crossing of an international border of one country to another country. And it also involves the consent of the person being smuggled. And this could be just a nominal or a kind of a forced consent in some cases. And generally, it's human smuggling is seen as a kind of a crime against the state, because it's about illegal transportation across borders from one country to another country. And it involves a consent of both the individual who is being smuggled and the smuggler as well. And it focuses on border crossing, and it typically ends after payment is processed, and the person arrived from the point where they departure to the point where they're supposed to be. And this is basically smuggling. And I think it's very critical to understand that smuggling is tied to the border, and anything that happens within a given nation state, within the borders of any nation state, is not seen as a smuggling in these kind of legal frameworks. Go to next slide, please. Yeah, so I just want to invite you to critically reflect on these kind of questions here. And the first question here is, who are the criminals in this case? I've already mentioned that individuals who are trafficking other people or coercing people to be recruited in this kind of a chain of trafficking. It could also be a group of criminal groups that have ties with multiple other groups, and then These are blackmailing the victims between themselves for particular kind of purposes, which are always exploitative in nature. And there are also corporations, and by this, for example, think about the endangered labor between African states and the Middle Eastern countries, like Qatar taking a lot of endangered labor from countries in East Africa, for example, Ethiopia or even Eritrea or other countries or Sudan. What kind of relationship do these people have? I have spoken to multiple people, and their experiences are really horrible. And this is generally seen in the international kind of discourses, particularly in the research related kind of discourses, as a form of forced labor. It's a forced trafficking, so labor trafficking in that sense. And it's also really critical to think about the state is as traffickers, or at least the state is creating the conditions for trafficking. Imagine, think about the situation of refugees, for example, when one state just grabs or can arrests people and takes them for offshore detention, for example. Think about situations in what is happening in Libya, for example, at the moment. And it's also about the endangered labor that I was talking about, when the state is actually actively involved in recruiting people from other places, but not treating them well, treating them with this kind of slave-like conditions. So the states are not immune, but the states are seen as benign kind of entities in the international legal systems. Nobody questions the intentions and actions of a state because a state is supposed to be a sovereign political entity with all the powers to protect its citizens. But most of the time, in particularly in countries like in Africa, the state is either fail in protecting victims but also actively involved in some of these kind of insidious ways of trafficking people or benefiting from trafficking itself. So, what is the discourse in general, particularly in kind of general terminology? Trafficking and smuggling, both of them are seen as a kind of endemic crime. It's spreading very quickly in many parts of the world, and there are millions of people and billions of benefits earned through these kind of processes. And there seems to be no end in sight for these kind of crimes as far as we can see from the data and from all the information that we have at the moment. And there is also discourse about survivor inclusion is part of the solution, and this is why we are doing these courses as well, I think. But I invite you to critically question these things. What does it mean to include survivors in these kind of processes, and giving them such a kind of a huge burden and responsibility to tackle a huge crime that the world and the states and the corporations and criminal gangs and individuals are involved with. And the reality in Africa, as general in the literature, shows that slavery has not ended. That this is what we keep hearing and listening to people who are academics doing the research, or also practitioners and civil society workers saying this is a form of slavery and it has never ended. And it has continued for centuries, even after the slavery of the 18th or 17th century. And this is a kind of a slavery because trafficking involves the loss of the body, that our bodies are being owned by other bodies who are exploiting them, that we have lost a political status, that no state is protecting us against these kind of crimes, that we have lost our home because traffickers are taking us away from our homes. So all of these kind of things that objectify the body of the victim are very similar to the slavery of the past centuries. And there is also discourse around the master suits having failed to dismantle oppressive structures of inequality, structures of masculinity, structures of interstate imbalances in the interstate relationships, and structures of violent borders. All of these things that created the conditions for trafficking and what is called smuggling to flourish. And I normally use the term intermediaries in some of the research I do in a state of smuggling, because intermediaries also help us to capture the movement of people within a given border. If one person travels from takes somebody from one city to another city within a given state, then they are doing a kind of a facilitative role that we normally call intermediary work. And there is also a knowledge of cracks that we need to think about when we think about trafficking. The traffickers actually have so much knowledge about where are the crackers to cross these borders, where are these people who they can bribe and recruit into this kind of chains of trafficking and smuggling. So such a knowledge of crackers is so powerful for traffickers and the people that we call smugglers to engage with and to acquire and also to deploy it against the victims and the systems that are trying to counter the trafficking and smuggling as forms of crime. You go to the next slide, please. So, having said that, and then how do we then think about a kind of a restorative approach? How do we move on from this kind of structures that are really oppressive and slave-like conditions still after centuries of of slavery? And how do we move on from this? So I think it is really helpful to think about the ideas of critique that we're all engaged in. What does it mean to critique some of these systems and say this is wrong and that's not good and we need to change that and this bit of these systems. Critique often produces answers that are locked within the oppressive structures at a grand scale of the term. And when we critique a particular system, we're trying to make it smarter and trying to answer certain kind of questions within that loop without questioning the bigger structural questions or conditions that create the conditions for trafficking and smuggling. So I'm suggesting here a shift from critiquing to questioning the systems as a systems and trying to see other ways of of creating humane conditions for everyone. And I'm also inviting you to think about what does it mean inclusion of survivors, inclusion of this and that, inclusion of that group of people and that. Inclusion always suggested that there is something to be included and there is a power, there is a group or an institution or organization that is including them. So that basically suggests that there is also a possibility of exclusion. If you're including somebody, you're also excluding. If there is no exclusion at all, then there is no need for inclusion, right? Because everybody is included. And that's why I'm trying to suggest maybe think about non-exclusive ways. And non-exclusion means radical openness. And this is what the literature in Africa tells us. It's about openness and opacity. And by opacity, I mean resignation, leaving everything that you have become to welcome the other in front of you and to say hello and welcome in that space, in that kind of environment that you live in. So non-exclusion is an idea of a radical openness, an invitation to work together as collective, as a learning collective, as a collective with embodied knowledge and lived experience to tackle these kind of bigger problems. And it's also very critical to think about what do we mean when we say human rights frameworks and all the time who is in the human rights and who defines that and who speaks for that, and why do we even need to talk about human rights more than we talk about human beings themselves? So think about all of these issues, and if human rights is an universal kind of the framework, then why do we have refugee rights, for example? Why do we have humanitarian rights? Why do we have other sub rights that provide or grant some level of rights, but not inclusive enough, not broader enough, or non-viable? So it's really critical to think about this kind of frameworks, particularly when they come from this institutional and Eurocentric frameworks. I've heard somebody mentioning about Afrocentric frameworks, but Afrocentrism and the African cultures and literature talks about relations between communities, between peoples, between lands, not just the relationship between human beings, but also the human beings and the nature around them as well. How is nature creating some of these conditions that displace people, for example? We call climate refugees. There are disasters happening in many places, and they are creating conditions for kind of trafficking, or maybe at least the displacement that then generates forms of trafficking. And it's also a very critical time to think about the theory of transition. period of transition from violability to restoration of dignity? What do we think when we talk about, for example, the coalition's vision, a theory of a change? What is the theory of change look like? How do we move from a position of violability and explaining and performing that victimhood or violability to a position of a restoration of dignity, where we speak from a position of dignity, where we relate to each other with a position of dignity, from a position of dignity? And how do we move from a position when we are speaking as vulnerable group to a position when we can speak without any sense of loss? We have already lost our dignity in some of these kind of institutionalized forms of trafficking. Then it's time to speak as people who have nothing to lose but to speak all the time. Can I go to the last one? I think this is the last one. Thank you. Back to you. Please.
Thank you so much, Hayab. Very insightful and also educational. I know that a lot of people ask for the information to be educational. So we would want to know if you have any questions. You can put them on the chat before the next trainer starts. If you have any question, please put them on the chat so that he can address it in time. So now we welcome Joy Sunday Kingsley to continue her own training.
Sorry, I'm just trying to pin my video so that everybody can see it. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning from whichever part of the world you're joining us from. For those who don't know me, my name is Joy Kingsley, and I serve as the Director of Movement Building for the African Survival Coalition. And I'm going to be taking you on the root causes, the factors fueling human trafficking in Africa. And what we are going to be covering is we are going to be looking at the socioeconomic drivers. Next slide, please. We're going to be looking at the socioeconomic drivers. We're also going to be looking at how conflict, displacement, and climate fuels human trafficking. We're also going to be looking at gender inequality and harmful cultural practices, weak laws and corruption, the demand for cheap labor and exploitation. Now, these are what we are going to be covering in this section. Next slide, please. Now, let's begin with the socioeconomic drivers. Now, the major socioeconomic drivers that promote human trafficking in Africa is poverty, unemployment, and low access to education or lack of education. Now, let's begin with one of the biggest root causes, which is poverty. Even till today in our continent, Africa has some of the highest poverty rates in the world. And for many families, survival is a daily struggle, as we know, how to find food, shelter, or even school fees. And when there is desperation, traffickers often see opportunity. So they begin to offer things like that looks like a lifeline, like, oh, they tell you things like, oh, a good job abroad, promises of a good job abroad, scholarship, or they even tell you things like we could help you start a business somewhere else. But too often, these promises most times turn to traps. And this is because when daily survival is uncertain, especially for many families in Africa, exploitation becomes even easier. Another major issue is unemployment. Even when young people manage to finish school, most times, often through the sacrifice of their parents or their guardians, they are faced with another wall, which is no job. And this is a continental issue in Africa, where even graduates struggle to get employment. And so day by day, the pressure begins to build up. They begin to have pressures from their families. They begin to think of how to take care of their family. They even have pressure from friends or the society to make it, because many young people want to make it and also maybe even impress their friends and family. And there's also the very deep desire for many young people to make their parents proud, because their parents saw them through school and they definitely want to make them proud. So all of this pressure can even push the most careful people to take risk. And traffickers know this. And so they come with different fake offers, modeling jobs. They tell you, take you abroad, visa arrangements, even most of these study abroad route programs. They know that many people are looking for a breakthrough, and people with few options are usually the easy targets for this. Sometimes families themselves, a whole family can even be misled. A trafficker might convince a struggling parent that they will help their child get a job in the city or take them abroad to study. But what do we see in the end? These young people are usually exploited either in domestic work, street begging, forced labor, or even so many other different worse situations. Another root cause is low access to education. Low access to education traps people in poverty. And in many African societies, schools are either very far or expensive, or the quality is so poor that children are barely even learning. As you can see in the picture, you see an image of children sitting on the floor to learn. There are no furnitures. There's no even conducive environment for them to learn. And when the environment is not even conducive for them to learn, they would barely be able to learn because they're already struggling to even learn as it is. And as we know, without education, people are less likely to get good jobs. And without jobs, poverty grows. And with poverty, vulnerability increases. So it becomes a full circle where poverty leads to lack of education, and then which then leads to unemployment, and then which creates room for these traffickers to exploit people. So most times it's not just about individual choices. It's about the systems failing people. And that's what we must all work together as survivors and people working in this sector to change. Next slide, please. Now, another major driver of human trafficking across our continent is the combination of conflict, displacement, and climate-related vulnerabilities. As some of us might know, that where there is chaos, traffickers thrive. Where there is chaos, traffickers thrive. In many conflict zones across Africa, either during war, terrorism, or intercommunal violence, armed groups use trafficking as a deliberate strategy. Sometimes they recruit children as soldiers, they force young girls into marriage or sexual slavery, and even men into forced labor. We've seen this happen in so many African regions, like the Boko Haram in Nigeria and Cameroon, and also armed rebel groups in Congo, South Sudan, Central African Republic, even insurgency groups in Mali, Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, and so many. If you check through the map of Africa, you'd see that many of these armed groups are infiltrating so many African countries. And in some of these communities, for example, in Nigeria, places like the northern Nigeria, like Benue, Plateau, Borno, people are being displaced from their homes and farmlands because of these issues of terrorism and intercommunal violence. They are displaced from their homes and they have to leave their homes and their farmlands because of these conflicts and insecurities, and are forced to move are forced to move because of the extreme violence from these bandits and extremist groups. Before now, they used to penetrate most of these villages at night. But currently, due to the insecurity rate in the country, they now even do this evil during the day. And so many homes are being destroyed, family members are killed or kidnapped, and sometimes entire villages are emptied overnight. And what do they use some of these kidnapped victims for? Some of the kidnapped children and young people are often taken by force and are tricked into recruitment as child soldiers. In some cases, these kids are even used to infiltrate peaceful communities and cities, and they carry out attacks, including suicide bombings. These are all forms of human trafficking, even though sometimes we only see them from the lens of terrorism, but there are also forms of human trafficking. And so when there is war, terrorism, and communal violence, what happens next? Displacement. This conflict then forced people to move or migrate, and then creating millions and millions of refugees and internally displaced persons. And so many people are forced to live in camps or in informal settlements, and often with no real protection. As we know, in so many of these settlements, there are no real protection. They do not have access to education or healthcare or even steady income. And when people are on the move like that and unsure of where their next meal or their next opportunity are coming from, traffickers see an opportunity and they move in. And so they exploit the fact that these individuals lack information about safe migration. They exploit the fact that they are desperate for jobs. They exploit the fact that they may not know their rights or have any legal protection. And also, what about the systems? Conflict and displacement does not just hurt only the people. It also breaks down institutions that are meant to protect them. For instance, if there is a case of war or terrorism, police and border officials most times become overwhelmed, and they can then become easily compromised, because even in the first place, most of these law enforcement agencies are underpaid. And so when they are underpaid in that way, they become easily compromised. It becomes easy for them to work with traffickers, because even they themselves, some of them are dealing with poverty.
Hello, Jacques, vous m'écoutez?
Please, let's ensure we keep our mics muted. And aside this, when there is conflict and war in certain communities, the judicial systems also becomes weak. And so it makes it even more difficult to investigate or prosecute traffickers. And when traffickers are not being prosecuted or investigated, it's like it keeps growing because nobody is being held accountable. And in the long run, corruption becomes even easier in settings like this, making it possible for traffickers to move people across checkpoints or borders with fake documents, bribes, and they use official covers for all this. Also, there would be, in instances of war and terrorism, there would be collapse of social services. In many conflict zones, basic services like schools and clinics would have to shut down. And without education or healthcare, families are forced to make impossible choices. Another silent driver is climate change, like droughts, floods, and failed harvest, which leads to food insecurity, especially in rural communities. And when there are situations like this also makes people migrate, also exacerbating the issue. In summary, on conflict, when there is instability.
Hello, est-ce que ça va chez tout le monde?
Aïe, can you please mute your mic?
Oui, ça va, ça va. Mais on écoute, on aimerait aussi d'autres explications si c'est possible.
I'm sorry about the obstruction. Please, I'm going to encourage everybody to mute their mics. This meeting is being recorded and it's going to be uploaded on the website, like I said, and be viewed globally. So we do not want distractions. Thank you. In summary, on conflicts, where there is instability, people move. And when people move, traffickers look for who they can exploit. Next slide, please. Now, looking at gender inequality and discrimination, this is not just a background issue. It is another driving force behind trafficking situations in many African communities and countries. And for many of us in this room, this is not theory, it's our lived experience. It is what we witness every day in our communities. Across many African societies today, gender inequalities begins even very early. Right from when we were growing up, we've always known that many families prefer male children, and which sometimes leads to the girls in the family being denied the same investment in education or opportunities or even basic care. In some traditions, you'd see girls are being seen as belonging to another family because they know they will eventually get married. And so some parents do not really invest in them because they feel like, oh, it's another family's property. And this belief alone increases the risk of girls being trafficked. Another is early and forced marriage is one of the clearest examples of gender inequality. When girls are exchanged for goods, for money, or to settle social debts without their consent, that is definitely trafficking. There is also the system of bride price that when it's misused, it can place a price tag on a girl's life. This makes the girl more likely to be seen as a property rather than as a person, especially in times of economic pressure or conflict. Now, sometimes families believe that they are actually doing what's best for these young girls, that they are trying to secure their future by marrying her off. But the outcomes often include exploitation, the end of our education, or even worse, long-term vulnerability, which makes her vulnerable to trafficking. But let's be clear, right? Let's set this clear. This is not about blaming African culture or African tradition. African culture is rich, it's beautiful, and is rooted in powerful community values. But I believe some of these practices must evolve. Any tradition that silences the voices of an individual or that limits her freedom or limits a person's freedom or controls a person's choices, especially for women and girls, that tradition or cultural practice needs to be re-examined and reinformed. Now, beyond even marriage, gender inequalities also shows up in discriminatory laws and practices, especially around land and inheritance. We've often heard stories of when a man dies, leaving his wife and children behind, some of his siblings or relatives tend to leave the wife and the children without any property, taking their land, their inheritance, and all of that. And when they leave these women and children like that, they push them into desperation. And as many of us know too well, traffickers prey on desperation. Even after surviving trafficking, sometimes women and girls are still shamed instead of being supported. And not just women and girls, even men. And that's why many people don't speak up about these issues. Even single mothers, sometimes when they try applying for jobs, they are being overlooked. Women survivors sometimes are damaged rather than empowered. And these are not just individual problems, they are systemic exclusions. And all of this increases the risks of trafficking or re-trafficking. So we need to also start talking about gender-based violence and how it operates alongside patriarchy, conflicts, poverty, and traps women in a cycle of exploitation, controlling women's bodies, silencing their voices, and limiting their choices. All of these conditions makes women susceptible to trafficking. But gender inequality doesn't only affect women and girls. It also affects boys. It also affects the LGBTQ youth. They also face high level of risk, and many of them face rejection from their families and communities, like we know. And this leads them to migrate. And sometimes these migrations are usually unsafe and makes them vulnerable to trafficking. And I understand that the issue of LGBTQ is a very sensitive topic in many African communities, but ignoring it doesn't make the problem go away. And when we allow this sort of discrimination to continue, we leave people unprotected. So we must begin to build leadership that includes all survivors, regardless of their gender or their identity. If we are truly serious about tackling this issue and also preventing it, we have to be willing to name these patterns and work to change them. Next slide, please. Now, lastly, I'm going to be touching on the demand for cheap labor, sexual exploitation, and domestic servitude. Now, yes, something we see every day. Now, looking at the images on your screen, this is something we see every day, but maybe we haven't directly connected it to trafficking. And all of these things that we see, all these pictures, one thing connects them together, which is the demand. The invisible market that fuels exploitation, the demand. Traffickers don't exist in a vacuum. They exist because someone somewhere is willing to pay for cheap labor, is willing to pay for domestic help, which they eventually turn around and abuse many of these people. And because people are also paying for sexual exploitation. Let's take street hawking, for example, looking at child street hawking. A child selling pure water or oranges or recharge card on the street sometimes. Sometimes we look at this as a family trying to hustle. But let's ask the real hard questions here. Who is collecting the money from these kids? Are the children allowed to go to school? What happens if they don't meet their daily targets? Now, street talking is one of the most accepted forms of child labor, and it has been normalized as family survival strategy. But many of these children are victims of trafficking themselves. Some of them were kidnapped and moved to another city and coerced to work and tied to invisible debts. And for many of us, this wasn't just something we saw, it was our reality. Please move to the previous slide, Michelle. For many of us, this wasn't just something we saw, it was our reality. Street hawking or domestic work was how some families survived. But survival often came at a cost of childhood, at the cost of safety, at the cost of education. And while these practices may have been normalized in our communities, they leave many children and entire families unprotected, unseen, and vulnerable to traffickers daily. And these traffickers know exactly where to find these children. Another is domestic servitude. Domestic servitude is one of the most normalized and underreported forms of trafficking in Africa. Why, you may ask? Because it is often hidden in plain sight. We see these people working within families, with extended relatives, and even faith-based organizations. Many of us were taught growing up that bringing a girl from the village to the city to help her is a way of charity, is a way of supporting her family. But when she's overworked, when she's unpaid, when she's denied access to education, and when she's not protected and she has no voice, she can't even speak, that is not help anymore. That is harm. That is harm. And it doesn't just affect girls. In many regions, boys and men are trafficked into forced labor on farms, mines, construction sites, where they are beaten, unpaid, or never even paid at all. And because they are male, because they are boys, society expects them to endure. The idea that sometimes you hear people say something like, at least they have a roof over their heads. At least they have a roof over their heads. And it is, and that sentence in itself is not protection. It is another way of justifying the harm that is being done to these individuals. Another is forced sexual exploitation. In many African communities, we see young girls that are they are lured with modeling jobs, marriage. Yes, that has been happening very recently. So many young women want to marry someone from another continent, especially from Europe or America, and so they want to travel, and some of them eventually get trafficked. Most of them, they are trafficked by people they know, even romantic partners or family. And sometimes these women don't even realize they've been exploited until it's too late. Sometimes trafficking does not happen with chains being tied in their hands and all of that. Sometimes it's being seen as survival or manipulation or grooming, where they've been made to believe that that is how life works and that is how their life is supposed to be. And traffickers know that. But when we and so when we look only at the behavior of victims, when we only blame the victims for falling into circumstances or situations like that, what we are doing then when we blame victims is that we are protecting the system that profits from their pain. So every time, instead of us talking about the victims and blaming them, I think we need to begin to ask questions about the demand. Every time we ignore the demand, we help traffickers sleep at night. And so we begin to ask questions. Who are these people patronizing these businesses and all? And that's where I'm going to be ending my part of this section. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that we've learned a lot from this session. I just want to say that the last thing you said about not focusing on the behavior of victims or blaming them, and also that way we do not protect the systems that exploit them. That is so profound. Okay, so we have questions for Hayab. I had reached out to him. Okay, he's still here. So Hayab, we have 3 questions for you. If it's okay to address them before the next person quickly comes in. The first question is, how is trafficking uniquely manifested in Africa compared to other regions? Can you hear me, Hayab?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, yes, of
Okay.
course. Yeah. And yeah, to just begin answering that question, but I think it was also answered in the presentation that Joyce has just given us, most of that. And Africa, the challenges in Africa are structural in nature and maybe different from other places, and some other places, not every places. And one of the major challenges is the nature of the post-colonial state that Africa has inherited with all these kind of institutional frameworks that are not designed to fit the social cultural fabric of the continent that is constantly resulting in constant wars and displacements and so many other kind of ethnic and national level kind of conflicts that are creating so much displacement and exploitation in the continent. And I think we cannot ignore these factors, these very big systemic challenges for the continent. And some of the scholarship is actually saying we must think even our borders, even our relationships. If we think about kind of the infrastructure in the continent that allows mobility from the continent only outside of it. I don't see there is a huge kind of infrastructure that connects the continent itself within itself, like all the countries bordering each other with these artificially colonial created borders, creating so much of this inequalities even within a given state, within any given state. I think those create the very conditions that create trafficking in a broader sense. But there are also specific challenges, as I mentioned it, like wars are very common and frequent in this place, and we're hearing a lot of wars happening now in Sudan, in Ethiopia, there are wars in Congo, there are wars in many places, and there are also terrorist-related incidents and operations like Joyce mentioned it in Nigeria and Burkina Faso and other places as well. So all these are very deeply kind of ingrained in how this kind of political structures in the continent, including corruption and other kind of things, uh, are fashioned, and that makes Africa a fertile ground for trafficking for trafficking, displacement, for smuggling, and all of these kind of things. And if I compare that with where I live now in Europe, there are so many structures here and there's so many kind of rigid, really bureaucratic structures, and also a lot of monitoring and a lot of visibilization of everything that happens in the continent. Like everything appears to be transparent, what is happening, yet it is not. There are smart ways of trafficking here as well, forms of exploitation. But I'm just saying the more visible and open kind of things that we can see are happening in Africa.
Okay, thank you so much. So the second question is, how do frontline responders practically distinguish between a smuggled migrant and a trafficked person, especially when exploitation emerges later?
Yeah, these questions are for you guys, for the practitioners who are always engaged in this, and they're very easy for you, but maybe a bit theoretical for me. So I've worked in with UNHCR and other organizations previously in Cairo and other places. So the process of identification at the point of arrival, at the point of contacting these people, normally can be so complex depending on the individuals, depending on other barriers. Is the identification involves language barriers, identification involves the level of trauma these people have experienced, the level of isolation and marginalization they have gone through, the type of services that are available, and all of this, so many things. So trafficking, I think the question begs to see the relationship between what trafficking and smuggling is and what it does. So trafficking, as I was saying earlier, involves ownership of the person, the victim, by another person. And smuggling is just a movement. So to identify a smuggled person, you can just look at if it is just for legal processes, you can just check whether they have crossed or not, a border, an international border or not. If they're basically saying, I have crossed this from this point to another point through this border, I have moved from Ethiopia to Sudan or from Sudan to Egypt, all of these things, with the help of a smuggler, with the help of somebody who exploited them, then that becomes a trafficker in the eye of the state.
Hello, est-ce que ça
But
va?
I was referring to other kind of terminologies to use to describe this kind of life-saving movements that are happening across borders, and that's why I use the term intermediary. And that allows us to work with what kind of survival
On
kind of
n'entend plus, hein?
C'est
On
est-ce que
n'entend
ça
pas,
va?
hein?
are involved
Très bien,
in
on
the
n'entend pas.
from one country to another country or across borders or even within the borders of a given state. But trafficking involves like, looking at all the actions and purposes and also the three elements that I was explaining earlier. I bet you know all these things more than I do. Like,
Okay, the final question, not so much of a question, but if you have any research that you could share with the participants to learn more about what you've trained us on so far. I think you can share that with either Joy or I via email if you have any. Thank you.
yeah, I will. I'm writing it in a blog if it is helpful, and I will also include some references and a list of links to some of the things that I have said.
Thank you so much. That would be very helpful. So now the next trainer, our very own Awa Francisca Mbuli. Please remember to use your emojis. Let's welcome her.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Chilean. This is something that we always list when we are highlighting causes of human trafficking. So it's a privilege today for me to have a deep dive into it. Thank you so much. Next slide, Chilean. Hello? Chilean, can you hear me?
Yes, please. Lucia is attending to you. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Quickly, we'll just go to define what a culture is. We look at culture as beliefs, customs, behaviors, traditions, activities, lifestyles that are shared by a group of people from their ancestors, passing it down from generation to generations. And looking at culture, we have those cultures that are really relevant and they are good, but when we want to look at the side of human trafficking, we tend now to highlight those types of culture or cultural practices where human traffickers use it as an aid to intersect those communities. Quickly, I will highlight some of those cultural practices that have shaped communities and they are very, very positive in their interaction and their daily activities, such as their manner of celebrating their events and traditional festivals, mourning, expression, clothing, language, that's dialects. Specifically in Cameroon, we have over 200 ethnic groups, and all those ethnic groups have their own dialects. So you can see how diverse it is and how they are really like culturally binding to each of their ethnicity. We have the food that people eat, eating habits, manner of communications, and the way people from a specific community look at others from outside. Next slide. Okay. Quickly, I would love to highlight some of the examples of those cultural practices that fuel human trafficking or which traffickers easily intersect to explore their victims. And it is very manipulative, and most often traffickers use institutions or places where communities have strict cultural norms or traditions, because some of these traffickers also tend to be people from those communities. Some of these examples quickly will include child marriages, forced marriages, arranged marriages. I know we are already versed with some of these terminologies, but arranged marriages, I will highlight on it. It occurs maybe in Cameroon specifically. Some tribes are bound to marry from their own tribes, even if it's not out of love. And then also for some tribe, when you get married before marriage, you are forced to marry to that person. So most often that is being arranged without the consent of both partners by the families, which are bounded by their cultural norms and traditions. We have community networks or familial misuse. This is like a family member knows that he needs to come back to his community and get one of his relatives to go and stay to enrich their lives. But when they go out there, they end up using them for their own economic gains, like hawking that Joy highlighted, or being used as sales boys, which at the end of it, they will not even set them up or set their own businesses. We have manipulative gender roles. Some communities look at women as a lower being, just attributed just to the kitchen and for childbearing, and which is not good. It's very exploitative and limits a young girl to fight for her future. We have misuse of religious or spiritual belief. This most often is in a community where people believe that there are certain spiritual belief that must be tied for that culture, but at the end of it, it is very exploitative, and those people coordinating that always use it for their own gains, thereby exploiting those involved. We have excess respect of fake religious leaders. We have exploiting traditional customs and obligations, such as female genital mutilation. This is somehow very tricky because in most often communities or villages that practices this, it's so painful, and most often most young girls are being forced to fled for safety, to run away from this. And when they fled, any of their host community, they are being forced to be exploited, either end up as prostitution or end up in a forced relationship because they are running from it. They have late male circumcision. Presently in Cameroon, where I am based, I noticed that it's my first time to notice that boys are being circumcised after 7 years of age. So that makes most of their mothers to accept their children going through that pain, send them to relatives out of this community. We have street begging, we have hereditary slavery. Next slide, please. So, yeah, and it continues with gender roles and patriarchy. The men should always be the men, and the women, you don't have any right to stand for your right. You have child fostering, apprenticeship traditions. We have traditional healing or medicine. This is something I will dive a bit on it. We have some commit like how will you say it? We have like some illness like epileptics that there are some traditional herbalists that are known to treat that. So most often they don't take money when they treat people. If you are a male child, when they treat you, they always agree that after that you become slave, you work with them or you practice with them and help them in their herbalist clinic. And then most often for the women, they will always accept in exchange of money that after that girl is treated, the girl will be married to the doctor, the herbalist doctor, which that is not good. They use that out of the will of their patient. We have cultural notion or debt and reciprocity. People, it might be somebody that borrow debt in that community. You have options to either pay, and if you cannot pay within a specific period of time, you are being exchanged either for your labor to serve the person which you borrow the money from. Then we also have community and hospitality trust. We have family and kinship obligations. Next slide, please. Sorry. So I'm sorry, I'm a little bit flowing up in between the slide because this is a presentation for myself and my brother Afasi. Okay, next slide is some ways it can happen because we have just been talking about it, but it's very difficult. It's very difficult to trace the barrier, how it really happens, since most of us are culturally bound. So we have misuse of familiar or community networks. People will ask you for your children, or as a community leader, you will need people to come and help you. But when you overdo it, I think you are misusing that privilege given to you, or you are misusing the child that was given to you, maybe to assist you in the form of a house girl, as Joy highlighted. We have manipulative gender roles and expectation. We have misusing religious or spiritual belief. Again, we have arranged child or forced marriages. Then we have exploiting traditional customs and obligations. When all these are put into practice and they are used negatively, these are some of the aspects that we can easily trace how harmful cultural practices are open for traffickers to intersect and gain their victims. Next slide. Okay. We have intensive effect of cultural practices used by traffickers. This is so much something that is very dangerous, but unfortunately rather, it is difficult to identify trafficking when this happens. And also, victims feel complicit or afraid or ashamed. Victims are so bound to their tradition and their culture, which most often it stops them from seeking help, as well as they see it as a must to do, or a way of life, or a means to an end. And also, they also stick to these abuses because they are afraid that their family lineage might be called by the traditional council or being punished. Another way that is dangerous, and it's always been into existence, is that outsiders, including law enforcement or social workers, may recognize the abuse if they are not aware of the cultural context. And it might be difficult even for them to also try to get in between people and their culture, because they know how important and how bounding people are very close to their traditions and customs. To that effect, I'll continue later, but I'll call on my brother Afasi to give a deep dive on explaining the various types of practical cultural practices which traffickers use to exploit their victims. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the great opportunity for us to understand how some of the cultural practices have contributed to human trafficking. And once again, my name is Afasi Komlan. I am a member of the African Survivors Coalition, and I'm given opportunity to talk about what the previous speakers or the previous trainers have emphasized on. And I just want you to know that it's a great opportunity for you to be here. And the topic of my discussion or my presentation is going to talk about traditions and cultural practices that fuels or contribute to human trafficking. And I'm going to be brief since the two speakers have elaborated on that. So next slide, please. All African countries have a certain culture, beliefs, and values that reflect both positive and negatively. Some of these cultural practices have contributed to human trafficking since 15th century up to 21st centuries. And today, I'm going to highlight on some of these. And some of these cultural practices have exploited individuals within the villages, the communities that we come from. Please, next slide. Let's use this opportunity to view or listen to a documentary that was done by the BBC in some few years back.
In 1997, I was filmed by an American TV crew at the place I was being held, Ghana, West Africa. I was labeled a Trokoshi, or a wife of the gods, paying for a crime committed by my uncle. But this report changed everything. An American viewer flew to Ghana to negotiate my release, and he adopted me. Now that I'm older, I feel ready to explore the cultural background of Trokoshi. It's practiced in parts of Ghana, Togo, and Benin by various ethnic groups, one of which is the Ewe. I met with a group of Ewe elders to know more about the practice. They tell me that people offer cows and goats as sacrifices to atone for their sins. I asked them if there had ever been human sacrifices. He's talking about Trokoshi, where you are banished from the community to pay for the crimes of your family. When I left the shrine, there were about 5,000 Trokoshi women and children in Ghana alone. Trokoshi was made illegal in 1998, a year after I was freed, but no priest had ever been prosecuted, and the practice still goes on. I met this young 14-year-old girl who is serving as a Trokoshi. Does she know why she's here?
That's what she doesn't know.
I felt sad. She came here 2 years ago at the age of 12. So she misses her mom, and I don't see how we can justify that. It was time for me to visit my birth family in Togo again. I had come to the village a few times, but I never had the courage to ask why they gave me away. 20 years after I was freed, I was now ready to ask my dad what he had agreed with my uncle. My uncle had committed adultery. His house was in the capital, Lomé, a long way from my village. Are you aware now where I was taken? He took me to Ghana, Volta region of Ghana, and I was placed in a shrine. He left me. I was supposed to be there for the rest of my life. This journey has helped me value my own freedom, but it was hard for me to discover that there are still women and girls living under the Trokoshi system. I hope that one day all girls will have the chance to reach their full potential.
Thank you very much. So this is one of the harmful cultural practices that is happening in West Africa. And I'm so glad viewers or participants have been able to see what some of our beautiful sisters are going through. So on this note, the misconception and abuse of African tradition and culture has contributed to a lot of human trafficking. And when you go to other parts of the continent, we have Utuala, that is kidnapping young girls for marriage. We have while fifth marriage. Fifth marriage is predominantly found in the northern part of Africa, where our brothers who are Muslims sometimes, you have the obligation to marry up to 4, but sometimes you see that the last wife, which is fifth wife, will also be given to the man to she come in as a wife and she worship all the 4 wives. So when she add up, it's going to be 5 wives. But the most important thing is that it's unofficial. They came in as they show up as a maid and eventually sexually exploited, and then they exploited them both sexually and other labor aspects. When you go to other parts of the continent, we also have the payment of dowry, what Joy emphasized in the beginning. In part of this continent, Ghana North, people are treated as an animal. So if you want to marry somebody, you can easily produce a couple of cows and they will trade that cows to you, the man, which has really created a lot of issues, because why do you want to treat a wife or your wife as an animal, which is very harmful. Female genital cut, Madam Francisca have also emphasized on that. It has also contributed to trafficking, which this is the only part of the continent that the people who claim they are superior, the priests, the traditional leaders can decide to say that, Afasi, you are this or you are that, you are possessed, and you'll be outcast. Being outcast, nobody wants to deal with you. Either you are given away to any perpetrator who want to use you, or you are cast out from the community or the society. The previous speakers have also emphasized on early child marriage and then forced marriage. Forced marriage and child marriage is also predominantly in the northern part of Africa, including Ghana and East Africa and other parts. Currently, Ghana is experiencing tribal war in the northern part. Basically, when you go into it, it's just trying to tell you that this tribe is superior than each other. And they are just dragging kingmanship and other things. And the people who become vulnerable are women and children. Please, the next slide. So what are some of the efforts that the continent, Africa, has made to prevent and combat human trafficking? In 1981, African countries joined the global effort to prevent and combat human trafficking by ratifying the African Charter of Human Rights, by also making sure that we respect the rights of people. Not only that, the Southern African Development Committee or Community has also been able to do something which is very great to prevent and combat human trafficking. African Plan of Action on Trafficking in Person, which was signed in 2009 to 2019. ECOWAS have also followed suit by also doing the same thing by signing another protocol, Initial Plan of Action Against Traffic in Person, 2002 to 2003, not quite long after the Paloma Protocol was ratified by most of the African countries. In addition to this, many African countries have also established anti-human trafficking agency to prevent and combat human trafficking. Example, the NAFTA in Nigeria has also contributed a lot, even though trafficking is still happening in this part of the continent. Now comes African Survivors Coalition. African Survivors Coalition pop up, or we try to also share life experience, tell story, and make sure that people understand that survivors from different parts of the continent will be able to come together to be advocate and also share experience to fight and combat human trafficking. Few months ago, we were represented in the UNODC to showcase some of the experience and to showcase some of the practical experience survivors have gone through. And it was a very, very fantastic experience for people to know that African Survivors Coalition is there as the African Union to represent each country to prevent and combat human trafficking. Next slide, please. Now, factors that affect reporting and protection. In the part of the continent that we all know that we respect our elders, and no matter how they say, even though we know they are lying, because of our cultural belief, sometimes it's difficult for you to tell an elderly person that you are lying. Stigmatization. You are scared to go and report your own family member because you believe that the stigma that will go against that family, you cannot talk about it. Even when you raise it, your family members will tell you, don't talk about this because it will go against the family. Lack of awareness. Many people in the part of this continent doesn't even know that there's something called the Paloma Protocol. So we are still focusing on this traditional practice, these archaic practices that are contributing harmful and other issues to our brothers and sisters. We don't know. So until we will come as a united front to prevent and create awareness and advocate for change, people will still go into this issue that we are all talking about, which is human trafficking and other forms of exploitation. Lack of political will. In Africa, maybe in the other part of the world, every 4 years we go to the poll to elect a president and parliamentary candidate. Due to this lack of political will, politicians knew that less than 4 years they will come back to you. So any harmful cultural practice that speak against our constitution may not be able to facilitate and speak against it. The video that we just watched happening in 1997, but I can promise you that the international communities mounted a lot of pressure in Ghana for them to do away with this harmful cultural practice. On this note, we even know that some of these things are going on in some of the vulnerable communities. Fear of retaliation. You are scared to go and report that somebody have exploited you sexually because in the community that you come from, you don't even know your fate. So people will not go and talk about it. This next point, Madam Joy also emphasized that people have normalized this harmful cultural practice as normal, which is not normal, we all know. And we believe that this is the time for us to stand and speak against it. This is the continent that we believe that the gods or supernatural powers will come after you when you are trying to speak the truth about something that is going on in the communities. You can see with the picture that we have it attached, the slide, that the elderly people are sitting down while the young guys are sitting barely on the floor. Please, the next slide. Our recommendation and approach to prevent and combat human trafficking. Few years ago, when African Survivors Coalition was established, one of our unique approach was Afrocentric approach. But let me start from the criminal justice approach. The criminal justice approach has been very, very effective in prosecuting traffickers and perpetrators, but it also overlooks the needs of survivors. So Engage Now joined the African Survivors Coalition to indicate some of the approaches that we believe it will help to prevent and combat human trafficking. One is the victim-centered approach the public health approach. The public health approach simply focuses on the physical and mental issues that perpetrators have subjected survivors into it. And this approach addresses the psychological issues and other trauma that survivors go through it, which is very, very important. Then come the faith-based organization. I believe the previous speakers have also emphasized on that. In Africa, even a pastor can tell someone's wife that come and stay in the chapel and pray till daybreak, they will do so. But when you are trying as a husband to let them know that those are not the truth, sometimes it becomes a problem. Even though faith-based approach is one of the approaches that we believe it will help pastors and other religious leaders to address the issue of human trafficking. Still, we believe that they have also contributed into human trafficking and other forms of exploitation. 2 years ago, Engage Now Africa, in collaboration with state institutions and African Survivors Coalition, had an opportunity to train law enforcement and religious leaders on how to prevent and combat human trafficking. Then come our approach called Afrocentric approach. Afrocentric approach simply means that since most of the African culture, practices, and traditions have contributed to human trafficking, we believe we need to sit down with our traditional leaders to capitalize on the positive approach of our cultural practices to identify and rescue people who are stuck in human trafficking and other forms of exploitation. We also believe that we trust our religious leaders. So when we sit down with them in policy reviewing and policy formulation, we'll be able to do more by identifying and rescuing victims of human trafficking and other forms of exploitation. Please, next slide. So, as I've mentioned earlier, engaging traditional leaders and community leaders will be able to influence and change policy. One of the tools that we are using this year is that we are training Queen Mothers to be an agent of change, because we believe Queen Mothers have that kind of passion to speak for the vulnerable ones. Addressing the harmful cultural practices, we still need traditional leaders to be part of the state institution mandated by law to prevent and combat human trafficking. Economic empowerment. We believe that when we entrust anything to Queen Mothers and traditional leaders, they will be able to make sure those allocations go straight to the people in need. Then poverty and economic inequalities, Joy have talked about it. Education and awareness is one of the key for us to use to prevent and combat human trafficking. On this note, I believe and I know that African Survivors Coalition approach to inculcate Afrocentric approach will help us to prevent and combat human trafficking. I thank you all for listening, and I will stand by for any question. Thank you.
Let's go ahead.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, preventive measures on cultural practices that are harmful to human trafficking. We have massive awareness and sensitization campaigns, education on human trafficking in vulnerable communities, because people don't know human trafficking, and as well as when these trainings are being held, it means that differentiate between their cultural practices and what on their cultural practices are. We have communities practicing such cultural manipulation should be identified and professionals stationed there. When we talk about professionals, we mean like creating peer groups, peer leaders from that community to be there so that they can know how they can transition their knowledge into the communities to guide people to know what is harmful and what is good concerning their cultures. And most often, we always love that these people should come from those communities. They should be members of those village. We have victims and survivors should be empowered with knowledge of their human rights, including their cultural context. Next slide. Next slide will further highlight and give an insight of this last point. Respecting cultural identity while promoting human rights and protecting survivors of human trafficking. This point also gives way to better explain the last point or the preventive method of harmful cultural practices that gives way for traffickers. Survivors come from diverse cultural background, and in many cases, culture is the key to our identity. Respecting cultural identity builds trust and encourages cooperation in communities and villages. This further explains when you respect a culture from a community, it gives way for the community members and the notables to trust you, and through that you can intersect them to better give them educational or knowledge on how to address their cultural norms which directly relate to trafficking. Next slide. Another preventive method for harmful cultural practices that gives way for trafficking is engaging traditional leaders and elders in prevention and awareness efforts to combat cultural practices while promoting means to combat human trafficking. Traditional rulers are very important in this fight since their people have deep trust on them. They are the gatekeepers of their customs and traditions. They are the holders of the laws and everything. And when we come through them, it gives way for the other community members to follow. That's why often when in a practical way we go out in our communities to raise awareness, we often start at the chief palace, because he is the one who will bring us, who accept us and grant us access to his community. When we start with him and he accepts us, then we know that we are good to go. Next slide. And this is so important that we want to go ahead to explain how we can best engage these traditional rulers effectively. I actually just highlighted some by explaining that as a preventive method, respect and acknowledgement. We have to be very respectful, even though there are some policies and royal policies that are just looking shabby, but when you go, they don't mind it. You need to respect it and acknowledge that he is supreme. When you do that, he himself, we are all humans, he feels recognized and he now assimilates with you. We have to build trust and gain the acceptance. We have to assimilate to those communities. If it's a community that you need to bow before you greet their chief, you need to do that. If you need to remove your shoes before you enter the palace, do that, even if the floor is earth. If you need to sit on the floor before you talk to him, you need to do that. All that is giving way for you to get him into your work, to actually see reasons why they need to work against their, not really against, to suit real exploitation or exploitation. We have to boost and highlight their leadership potentials in protecting the vulnerable and their communities at large. We have to use cultural relevant language. We have to try even to learn how to just greet or tell you thank you. I remember while in Kenya, we all learned how to say thank you. And while in Ghana, I am very versed with Akwaba. So those little tips makes the people of that community or their leaders feel that you really love them and you want to be like them. Thank you. Next slide. How to go about it. We need to create peer-led trainings for this. First, to start by the elders, because after the chief accepts you, the next people, you need to follow that ladder of leadership, because I know respect is alternate in such communities and villages. We need to train their elders and their notables, because they are the people to take it to the sub-communities and to their various families. And this notable should be done by using one of them who is versed with the language and can better pass on a message. Radio shows, games which respect values using their dialect should be used also to better pass our messages. We have to use storytelling, proverbs, or parables to explain trafficking. We have to use community gathering, either by the community gathering we create or assess the village during their own community gatherings and try to give some talks. Faith-based collaborations with the Christian denomination accepted and highly present in that village. There are some villages that have accepted Christianity, and they have just like one Christian denomination that it's highly respected. So if you use the leader of such faith-based community and groups in those villages, they will respect them highly. We have to use one of their own in the project team, which I've already highlighted above. Next slide. By doing so, we know we need to face some challenges, and we need to struggle to seek solutions to challenges. Coming to some people, living their lifestyle, trying to cajole them or to direct their lifestyle to a new one is somehow difficult. We need to know that challenges such as resistance to change, fear of losing their cultural identity, lack of awareness will hinder us. But what are the solutions that we will propose to better do this? Some suggested solution to this challenge or hindrance is by using community rulers. Okay, in using community rulers will include providing ongoing support and recognition, frame change as cultural evolution, not destruction or abolishment of their existing traditional norms. Use peer influence, e.g. get one of the notables or elders which you know is so close to the chief and the people in the community respect him so much, and start by convincing him. I think that the others will better follow. Next slide. Okay, we'll end our presentation with this little talk. Culture should protect its own and not exploit it. And even though we respect culture, we should not forget that we should stand together when it becomes exploitative and harmful. This is how I will end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Afasi and our Francisca, for this wonderful presentation. And your last slide, I would say, is what the African Survival Coalition actually stands for. So when it's exploitative, it's a no-no, and we would not support that. Finally, I had put in the chat that if you have any questions, even if we cannot address them here, as most of our speakers, especially Hayab, is no longer here. But if you have any questions, you can put them on the chat and they will be addressed, and response will be put on the African Survival Leadership Academy. Okay, so now we have just one last exercise to test our memory, to see if what we've learned we retained, to also see how we are going to put the information we've learned here to use. So I'll be sharing with us again using Mentimeter, the same platform we used before. Please, Lucia, could you stop sharing so I can thank you? Thank you. Okay, so Lucia, please check the link and share on the chat. I had already shared the question before. Can you see it?
I can see your screen.
Okay. Please share in the chat. Thank you. Okay. So please start responding to the questions. The first question says, what is the main difference between human trafficking and human smuggling? That's the one Hayab gave us information on. So please, are you able to, okay, responses are coming in. Okay. We have only 7 responses and we have over 30 persons in the platform. Good.